is in First Peter this week. Okay. And so what First Peter is a letter. So I don't know how many, you guys have probably all had how to write a basic letter in school, right? You guys know how to write a letter. So what is the part that Monty just read? What is that classified as in a letter? What is that? Does anyone know? It's a really easy answer. Don't think I'm trying to trick you.
I haven't had these letter lessons.
I honestly just don't get the question.
That's okay. What we just read at the beginning of every letter is what's called a salutation or a greeting.
Dear blah blah blah.
You got it.
Salutations.
Except Peter just used a lot more words than dear so-and-so. So each week we're going to kind of be looking at this letter as the body of a letter continues. So this first week we're going to be looking at Paul's salutation. And if you know anything about a salutation of a letter, it kind of sets the tone, kind of sets what you're going to be talking about. You know how sometimes in a letter if someone just says hey man, you know it's going to be kind of more of a casual letter. Well, if you have, here, dear sir, doctor, physicist, MD, PS, MBA, astronaut, you know it's going to be a very formal letter. So we're going to look at just kind of what and how Peter's going to start this letter and what that's going to mean for the rest of, the book or letter.
Because it's only so small.
Yeah, it's a pretty small letter. Well, it's a pretty small book, but it's a fairly, if you think about it, it's a pretty long letter. I wrote some letters in my life, but this is fairly lengthy. But he had a lot to say. So that's why I'm only going to focus on these first two verses this week, because there's a lot in it. And a lot of the times, we just kind of glaze over, kind of like what Jeremiah said, is you almost skip over the intro just because, it's very elementary. But what Peter is saying here, there's a lot in it. So I want us to kind of slow down and just look at it. And I want to kind of give you guys kind of the background of, why he's writing a letter. Because usually if you take time to write a letter, usually you're going to say something and it's going to be important. And there's a reason why you're writing the letter. So a little bit of background. Who knows who Peter is?
He's a disciple.
He is
an apostle.
Apostle. Those can get confusing.
So the apostle are the people who directly followed Jesus and from his teachings and who lived with him.
Mm-hmm.
And the disciples are people who follow his teachings, who spread the word around.
Right. So an apostle were eyewitnesses of Christ, and then the disciples are ones who are being mentored and taught by the apostles or just the word. Right. So Peter's an apostle, and he's writing this letter to, to five different places. And Monty did a great job at pronouncing those places, because they're not just Chicago. These are kind of weird named places.
Asia's the only
Well,
one.
Asia is pretty standard, yeah.
Most of them are in Asia.
Yeah. So Paul is starting to write this letter, and he's writing this letter in the time kind of where there's persecution starting to happen. The letter is thought to be written right around the time of Nero. And if you know anything about Nero was the
capital Kaya.
He was
He was very, very awful to Christians. The persecution, he blamed the Great Fire of Rome on the Christians.
But didn't he actually start it?
There are numerous things that say he most likely started it, but no one knows for sure. But it was almost positively not the Christians.
It's highly likely that it was him. It's just hey, let's blame this, blah, 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 blah.
So, but
I think it was this little Larry.
But this letter isn't written necessarily during the intense persecution of them, but there's persecution beginning to happen. And we can tell that because in this first part, you can tell where the writers are, the condition of the writers, is that he uses the phrase exiles. Does anyone else, this is in verse 1, does anyone else have anything different than exiles? Does NIV use exiles? Or does it?
In where?
It's in the first verse.
Mine has...
Yeah.
He used exiles. Joseph, does yours use exiles?
To God's elect exiles scattered throughout the provinces.
Okay, so he's used exiles. So what is an exile?
To be
To be
thrown
ca-
out of an area.
thrown out of an area,
Cast out of society.
cast out, away from home, right?
A hermitage. Kind of a hermit, but isn't that
Like a
kind of like a
forced hermitage,
yeah?
kind
I
of,
live on
Well, hermitage is where you live.
by yourself.
I
Yeah.
live on
No,
a
it's like the
Hermitage
house of
Street.
hermit is what I meant.
True.
So a hermit is isn't that kind of like your own choice? Like,
Right. So what Paul is writing here, he's writing to people who are no longer living in their physical, where their home was. Because of persecution, they've been forced to leave. So he's writing to these Christians saying, hey, like the rest of the letter. So he's writing to these people who are physically been away from their homes. And kind of like what we were talking about in service, how it's kind of like how we go through seasons of lament, of sorrow, of having to ask God, like, why is this happening? And this is why Peter is writing to these people, because you're literally being persecuted, verbally, physically. You're kicked out of where you've grown up at. Like, imagine you guys, like, all of a sudden someone comes up to your house and says, hey, you have to get out, you have to move, you can't even stay in Chicago.
That's
And
just wrong.
it's just wrong, and it's unfair, and it's scary. And so he's writing to these people who have all these emotions, and they're like, God, why is, like, and these are all Christians, so they're like, God, are you abandoning us? What's going on?
that'd be very confusing.
It would be very confusing and hurtful. But I also want to look at, I want to just focus on the one word exile here. I know, like, we can breathe past it just because, like, we think we know what it is. But Peter is using this word, and this is going to set the tone for the entire rest of the book, and even goes all the way in through Revelation, is just this idea of being in exile. And I already talked about they are away from their earthly homes in a different location. But Peter is using this word also metaphorically, saying we as Christians, because his audience is Christians, we as Christians are living somewhere that isn't our eternal home. We're living on earth temporarily, but our home where we're going to live forever is in heaven. So he's using this word exile to communicate with us that earth isn't it. There's more than earth. And I looked up the meaning of kind of the idea behind the word exile in that time period. And the word exile, that person had almost, when you're in a different place, you don't have like the legal rights that you would like a normal citizen would have. So people would look at you kind of like, what is he doing here? You know, like, is he good? Is he bad? So there were people who kind of like were skeptical of you because you were a foreigner. But then the flip side of that, as an exile, not a citizen, like, you're not a citizen, so you're not bound to necessarily having to participate in everything that citizens would have to participate in. For example, you know, living in Chicago, while I'm still in school, I live in Chicago, but my home address is still back in Iowa. I don't have to pay Illinois taxes because my home address is still in Iowa. I still have to pay Iowa taxes, but even though I'm living in Chicago, that's not where I permanently was, if that makes sense.
Not really.
You still,
So-
you still have to pay Iowa taxes?
So you still would have to pay Iowa taxes.
When I grow up, do I have to pay Georgia?
No, where you're a
Wherever your address
wherever
is.
your home address is, like wherever you're a citizen, like wherever your driver's license says you live, that's where you pay taxes to.
So why wouldn't you go to the lowest taxed area, get your driver's license, and go wherever you want?
Because you have to live there.
'Cause you have to live there,
And Illinois taxes are more expensive.
and they're more expensive. But so, okay, going with that idea, so like when you're in exile, when you're at a different place, you don't have to participate. You know, in the Roman time, as I look at this, Romans were very religious, not in the sense that they worshiped God, but they worshiped everything except God, and everything in their culture pointed to a different God. Kind of, you know, like they had feasts for gods. They had, you know, their houses were built in a certain way for gods. And everything, there you go.
Yeah.
And everything was pointing to their gods. And the way their gods worked was you have to please the gods, otherwise bad stuff is going to happen to you. So when Christians came and said, no, we're not going to do these things for those gods, they're like, oh, you're upsetting the gods. So every bad thing that happens is because you upset the gods, and bad things are happening to us. And that's why Christians were really, really persecuted, because people thought Christians were upsetting the gods and causing their lives to be awful.
Which is not true.
Which is not true, because the Christians were right.
Wouldn't that be kind of silly in a sense? Because, like, that means if a little boy was playing with matches and burned down the house, it would be because of Christians.
Or if your name is Nero and you were playing with matches and burned down the city, blame it on the Christians. Yep. But, so I want you guys to get this concept of Christians living on earth, being exiled away from our Heavenly Father's home.
That's not
I
right.
just kind of think is living on earth in your earthly body is just a test.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's a test.
Is it-
Even though,
Aren't we
even though,
already exiled in a sense because Adam and Eve was kicked out?
True.
Of Garden of Eden, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Joseph.
So yeah,
Yeah.
what we're all living in is not where we're eternally supposed to be.
it's like the exile where you choose your next path of, do you want to join back the community of redemption and living forever with God, or do you choose the same path of being exiled for all eternity?
Right. All right, so follow with me here. So we're exiles. So what that means for us is that we're on earth and we have to live here. Okay? Like, just like these people kind of were forced to live in these places.
And ever since we sinned, we were kind of like exiled to Earth.
Ding, 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 winner, winner, chicken dinner. But we're here.
Yum.
But just because we have to, that's creepy. But just because we have to live here doesn't mean that we have to abide by what all the earth is telling us. Because like Jeremiah said, is that there is sin and that there is destruction in this world because of sin. And our earthly, heavenly, eternal kingdom does not have that. And I want you guys to think about this. What Peter is really telling us, and this is going to go through the rest of the book, and even on through Revelation where he's talking about the second coming, is that we're only here on earth for a little bit. And as we're living here, we're not to abide, follow, give into what we're just passing through, but we're supposed to live as where we're eternally going to be. So what God tells us is the ultimate authority, not what the world tells us. What God has commanded us is the ultimate authority, not what friends at school tell us. And then, so we're exiles. So we're searching and we're hoping and longing for an eternal kingdom that's not on earth, that earth can't offer, but will only come when Jesus comes back. And I want us to kind of read down. So he says the exiles, and then he talks about these different places. And these places, guys, aren't that different from Chicago. These places were larger cities in that time, very diverse, full of all sorts of people, all sorts of thoughts. And these Christians were having to live in them. And let's look at verse 2, okay? We're going to look at verse 2. So Peter says all these things, he says, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father and the sanctification, that's a big word, everyone say it, sanctification.
Sanctification.
Of the Spirit for the obedience of Jesus Christ and for the sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. I want to also look at the second part of sanctification. Does anyone have any idea what that word means, sanctification?
No idea.
No idea. Okay, you have an idea?
It means, we learned this, but now I'm just kind of guessing.
It's okay.
It's when something's put aside for a certain purpose.
Mm-hmm. Set aside. When I think of it, I sometimes think of it as almost kind of like a white tablecloth. And I think of it as, you don't use a white tablecloth just to have friends over and eat pizza. You use that for like a specific, a nice supper where you have, there's a meaning behind it, not just friends hanging out. Like when you can eat a formal dinner. And so like you sanctify, you set it apart. So what Peter is saying is like, you Christians, because because God has sanctified you, has set you apart, given you special meaning. He says, may grace and peace be multiplied upon you. But think about what they're going through. He says grace and peace. What is so graceful and peaceful about getting kicked out of your home and living somewhere where you don't even want to live and you're being persecuted?
That's
No taxes.
No. Well, no, they would still have to pay Roman taxes. That's
Why?
cool too, because they're in Rome. But he's saying,
Wait,
look, you're
exile-
set apart. Yeah. He's like, you guys are set apart for a specific purpose. Going back to the exile thing, he's like, you're set apart, not that you're going to be,
it's almost
blessed
relates
on
back to
earth.
the, slavery in Egypt.
Slavery in
almost.
Egypt. He's like, you guys are set apart. You're going to, suffer here, but your eternal home is in heaven. And that's what you have been made for. So as Christians, we need to realize that as we go through life, being a Christian means that we are in exile, that not everything is going to be fair for us. People are going to look at us weird most of the time, more so than others. I get weird looks all the time. But that we are exiles. We aren't of this world. And also not being part of this world does not mean that being not part of this world means that we are no longer having to follow every little thing the world tries to tell us. That includes, all the things that it's saying about sex, all the things that it's saying about lying, about cheating, about gossip. We don't have to do that. That's not what God has called us to. That's something we choose to partake in. So as we're Christians, we need to continue to live in a heavenly in a heavenly mind, where we know our home isn't here, but it's on earth, that we're just living here just for a little bit. And also realize in our life that God has called us with a specific purpose that the world can't change or take away from us, but he's called us here for a specific purpose. And he says